Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm the Vice President of Policy here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Today, we're hosting a workshop entitled Everything You Need to Know About Surface Transportation Funding and Policy. The idea here is to spend the next 90 minutes with one person who knows more about this stuff than anyone I've ever met, and uniquely possesses the capacity to explain it all in a way that helps make sense of the sometimes strange and unique ways that transportation policy works at the federal level. Jeff Davis, of course, is our senior fellow and editor of Eno Transportation Weekly, the go-to resource on everything transportation. Most of you on the line, I'm sure, read Transportation Weekly on a regular basis, and if not, you should definitely get on the list. Jeff has been involved with transportation policy and budget matters since the late 1980s and has been writing Transportation Weekly since 1999. We're really excited today to launch into this workshop. For those of you that are tuning into an online Eno event for the first time, Eno is a independent, nonpartisan think tank that helps shape debate on critical multimodal transportation issues. Among lots of other things. We are celebrating our 100th year of being the nation's leading independent transportation-focused institution. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Davis here in a minute, where he's going to break down surface transportation, reauthorization funding and prospects, what to expect in the Congress, some of the new administration's potential policy initiatives, and much more. But a few housekeeping items first. We will have a few opportunities for questions that'll pop up throughout this workshop. The easiest way for you to ask your question is to enter it into the question box on the side of your screen at any time, and we'll get to as many possible questions during those Q&A sessions. While we don't expect any tech issues, we found that if you are experiencing problems, the easiest thing to do is to exit and rejoin the webinar. And a lot of times that helps clear up minor issues. We will have the slides, the recording, and the reference sheet available to all of you within the next day or so. So stay tuned for all that. And with that, Jeff Davis, if you take it away.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks very much for everyone. And I've only been involved in transportation since the mid-90s, not late 80s. I'm not quite that old, but thank you. So yeah, it's an impossibly large prospect. And we're going to be having more of these webinars as the year goes on. But this one is going to be more about the funding side of things, and also trying to get at this early enough in the process to where that people can identify the really difficult fundamental questions that haven't really been asked and answered for decades. That really, since we're in the current situation we're in, we're not going to ask these questions now. They may never get asked again. Basically, now turn on. There we go. All right. The FAST Act, which expired last year, funded 4 major areas of surface transportation: highways, mass transit, highway motor carrier safety, and intercity passenger rail. The late lamented FAST Act, which expired September 30th of last year, has been extended for 1 more year to September 30th of this year, authorized a total of $305.5 billion over 5 years. As you can see, highways were about 77% of that, $226 billion. Mass transit authorizations were $49 billion, 17%. Safety was 3% at $8.2 billion. And the intercity passenger rail was $10.4 billion, or about 3% of the total. There are 2 sources of funding for almost all of that: the Highway Trust Fund or the old General Fund, or as the General Fund is technically known, any funds in the Treasury not otherwise appropriated. So the first part here is going to be a little bit about the background and the prospects of the Highway Trust Fund. It was created in 1956 to fund both the construction of the interstate highway system and the regular federal aid highway program, which was already 40 years old at that point, and had been working on general fund funding until 1957. It was based on the user pay, user benefit concept, or what you look up in tax philosophy as benefit taxation model, so as not to cause general fund deficit spending, because President Eisenhower and Congress were very clear on that. They wanted new highways so long as they did not cause a federal deficit increase. And at the time, trust funds were not part of the federal budget calculation. So the deficit only showed up in the general fund, and that's one of the reasons why they created the Highway Trust Fund in the first place. It was highways only, and then after a lot of resistance from big cities, particularly San Francisco and Boston, eligibility was expanded in the early 1970s so that some mass transit purposes could be served with Highway Trust Fund dollars. And then after much more dispute, there was a permanent mass transit account established in January 1983. The bill was passed by Congress, negotiated in 82, passed by Congress, and right before Christmas 1982. Reagan didn't sign it till January 6, 1983. So, the 82 Act is technically January 83. Highway Trust Fund revenue sources, and these are the last 3 years average net tax receipts. The 18.3 cent a gallon gasoline tax that goes to the Highway Trust Fund, 26 billion a year. The diesel tax of 24.3 cents a gallon, about 10 billion a year. There's an additional 0.1 cent per gallon that goes to clean up abandoned service stations. That doesn't go to the Highway Trust Fund. We're not talking about that here. There's a 12% tax on the retail sales price of new trucks, tractor trailers. That's about 5 billion a year. That one's a little more volatile than the others because new equipment purchases by fleets are very much part of the business cycle. When things are good, big companies will accelerate and buy more trucks. When the cycle crashes, they will postpone and drive old trucks longer. Heavy truck tires per tire based on a load capacity formula, about 500 million a year. And the annual heavy truck use sticker that's capped at $550 a year, no matter how heavy your truck is, that's usually a little over $1 billion a year. That's also kind of volatile for reasons I don't fully comprehend. So for the last 3 years, we've had net taxes of about $43 billion a year coming into the trust fund. Add to that 600 million a year interest on balances, and that's now gone between the balances spending down and the lower interest rates. And then about $77 million a year in highway safety and motor carrier safety penalties. So you get $43.6 billion a year averaging of highway trust fund deposits over the last 3 years. That's a good amount of money, but since 2008, it hasn't been nearly enough. Those tax rates haven't been increased since 1993 for the most part. The last 5 years of highway trust fund cash flow, you can see deficits of $13 billion or so, rising to $15 billion in FY20 because of some COVID-related revenue issues. And Congress's solution has been periodic ad hoc bailout transfers into the highway trust fund from other federal funds, principally the general fund. Through the end of FY20, the end of the FAST Act, there had been $140 billion of general fund transfers in September 2008 when they ran out of money. There were another $3.5 billion of transfers of that other 1/10 of a cent per gallon. But if you go on the user pay, user benefit model, those really aren't bailouts. Those were misallocated user fees in the first place. So I put together this lovely little chart. The red line is the annual cash out the door, spending outlays out of the trust fund each year, starting in 2007, the last good year, and going through last September, the end of FY20. The blue vertical columns are net receipts and interest, and then the periodic green columns on top are the periodic general fund bailout transfers. And you can see they were about $70 billion over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 installments of 08 through 15, and then the $70 million in FY16 that was then to spend down over the life of the FAST Act. So I'm very proud of that little chart, trying to show it all in one place. Highway Trust Fund is supposed to be 90% self-sufficient. When they were debating the Budget Act in 1974, Senator Sam Nunn, Democrat from Georgia, got up on the Senate floor and said that this whole thing about mostly the trust fund should be mostly self-sufficient doesn't cut it. He put an amendment on the Senate floor that said you cannot consider any new legislation that creates new mandatory spending from a trust fund. Actually, no new mandatory spending at all, except if it's from a trust fund and the trust fund is at least 90% self-sufficient on taxes related to the purpose for which such outlays are or will be made, and then also Social Security. So this was intended to single out the Highway Trust Fund and the new Airport and Airway Trust Fund so they can continue on reauthorized. And Nunn's amendment set at 90% threshold, passed the Senate by a vote of 80-0, has been law ever since in Section 401 of the Budget Act. Now look at what's happened from 2008 through 2020, the last 13 actual fiscal years. Tax receipts and interest were 516 billion versus the 140 bailouts. That's only 78% self-sufficient, 21.3% bailouts, actual dollars over 2008 through 2020. So people would always ask, well, what about that 90% self-sufficiency rule in Section 401 of the Budget Act? Well, the problem is that it hasn't been enforced. The House Rules Committee has waived all points of order against every surface transportation bill that's come up since then. And in the Senate, points of order don't enforce themselves. Some senators got to stand up and make it. 60 votes can waive anything. And also, it's a point of order against the bill coming to the floor in the first place. It's not a surgical point of order that can be raised later to knock things out. And it's proven really difficult to raise points of order against consideration or MTP. So basically, the Congress has not enforced the 90% self-sufficiency rule for trust funds. So here we have that previous chart from 2 slides ago of 07 through 20. And then I've added on the new, as of last week, congressional budget baseline for the trust fund in the future. We had a $13.2 billion transfer, a little green bar, top of FY21 there. But then that's going to be spent out by late summer 2022, CBO says. So then from then on out, you see the inexorable rise of the red outlay line as each year's new obligations are increased in the baseline by a shade over 2% for annual inflation adjustment, WITI, as they call it. And then the blue columns for actual taxes are going to stay about constant. So at the tail end there, you see that the annual deficits are projected to get worse and worse and worse. The 10-year revenue hole, if you wanted to fulfill, to fill the gap between the blue columns and the red line for the next 10 years, $200 billion, CBO just said. The annual deficit is going to go from $13 billion next year through $28 billion a year in 2031. If you just wanted to fill the first 5 years of revenue hole, it's only $75 billion. It's not that much more than FAST Act because, again, we just had $13.2 billion deposited 4 months ago by the extension, and $200 billion over 10 years. Now, that's just under baseline spending, where you get last year's number, which was the year before also under that freeze, and plus 2% a year. You had the Democratic bill last year, infrastructure bill, that was going to provide a significant increase in spending. I've shown that, extrapolated that here. The red line is revenues. The black line is baseline obligations, limits and exempt CA. And then the green line is the House Democrat bill from last year pushed 1 year forward. So I took their FY21 reauthorizations from last year's bill, moved those to FY22 for the first 5 years, and then for the next 5 years, just added CBO's annual 2% and change increase. And you can see, that at that point, in 10 years from now, you'd be having, $95 billion a year in new spending commitments, still only about $43 billion a year from spending. And as you'll remember, last year's Democratic reauthorization bill kicked the can down the road and didn't do anything about long-term trust fund solvency. If you wanted to fill the highway trust fund's revenue hole solely with increasing gasoline and diesel taxes, and a lot of people discussed it, no one in a position of power is actually advocating that. But were you to do that, and you wanted to do it all at once, you need an immediate, as of October 1st of this year, 10.5 cent per gallon increase to pay for a 5-year bill at the CBO baseline level. To get to your $75 billion over 5 years, you do 10.5 cents up front, or else you do a smaller amount up front and then stagger it in over years. 10 years from now, in FY 2031, if you want to raise that $28 billion deficit that year, then and just do it in that year, the taxes would have to be 20.5 cents higher than they are right now in 2031. So gasoline would have to at some point get to 38.8 cents per gallon, and diesel would have to get to 44.8 cents per gallon federal taxes to be in balance in the year 2031 by itself. But there's a problem with excise taxes in the rest of the budget. If say you or I own a mid-sized trucking company and the fuel taxes go, and Congress raises fuel taxes a bunch, and it increases our fuel cost by $1 million a year, all we do is we go to our tax return, we increase our fuel cost deduction, in our business expenses, deduct that off our taxes, and our income tax rate burden goes down a little bit. Broadly speaking, economists say that same kind of substitution effect happens in households, which is why every excise tax increase means that somebody somewhere out there in the economy has a little less income, and thus pays a little bit less income tax and or payroll tax if you're an employer. And CBO and OMB used to have a little rounding thing they did where they'd say, okay, every dollar of every excise tax increase, I think, lost 20 cents, 25 cents in general fund revenues and or payroll tax Social Security Trust Fund revenues. They had to change that because of the staggered dates of expiration of the various lower taxes in the 2017 tax reform bill. But so it varies by year now. But every increase in an excise tax will now decrease payroll and income taxes by 20 to 25 cents. If you dedicate a tax and excise tax increase to a trust fund, the trust fund gets credited with that gross amount of spending, but the decreased funding on income and payroll side is the general fund's problem and maybe Social Security Trust Fund's problem. So even though it wouldn't make a difference to the trust fund itself, it would have to be accounted for the larger budgetary math. So that's the situation that our purported user pay, user benefit trust fund has been in for the last 13, 14 years. So fundamental question number one we have here is, why bother? Should the user pay, user benefit model be retained? So hopefully, if our IT is working here, we're going to be able to do a little poll thing here so that people can actually vote to keep people awake. There we are. You can select yes or no here, so we'll keep people awake, during this thing with some audience feedback. And as we discuss, I'm going to go to the next slide for a second while we talk about it, because there's some, if you're going to say yes, that we should retain the user pay system, then the answers are pretty clear. We've either got to increase user tax rates to match the spending levels, or decrease the spending levels to match the existing user tax levels, or meet somewhere in the middle. And it's actually, the math is very simple, but the problem is, that's like saying that losing weight is just about some combination of decreasing the number of calories you consume and increasing the number of calories that you spend, which is also, the math is very simple. Anyone who's seen my fat ass walking around in public knows that in real life, it's not, making the math work is not that simple. And politically speaking, it's just a question of raising user tax rates so that the gas tax will be doubled in 10 years, or massive cuts in benefits to and spending benefits to stakeholders. They're both rather difficult. If you want to jettison the model, that actually makes more sense from a taxation principle, but then you have to ask yourself, should you all abolish the trust fund entirely and put it all in the general fund and make everyone fight it out of the appropriations every year? Or should you come up with some kind of budgetary structure, some trust fund or trust fund like structure that's separate from the general fund, to allow you to have your program separate from the regular budget, but also explicitly delink it from user pay, even though that takes away a lot of the principle of the trust fund? Paul, we were going to maybe discuss that for just a second. Talk about poll results.
So the poll results are in, and if this were a California ballot measure, it would fail, but only by just a little bit. 65% of you said yes, that we should retain the user pay model, but I'm actually surprised that 35% voted no against it.
Yeah. Well, there are, if you keep the user pay, user benefit model, there are other things that come along with it. And I believe that some of the 35% no voters have realized some of that, and the downstream consequences and issues that keep coming up over and over if you keep saying that you're on the user pay model. Okay.
So Jeff,
yes.
There are a couple questions. Is this a good time to address those? Is that all right?
Sure.
So one question came in talking about the gas tax and the diesel tax, and just asking why is there a difference between the two of them? And I assume that that's the difference in the rate. Is that because there's increased wear and tear with diesel, which is associated with trucks, or is that differential mostly because it's easier to raise diesel taxes because truckers or trucking companies don't necessarily vote?
Using diesel to fuel over-the-road trucks and buses is a fairly new thing. It didn't happen after World War II. Trucks and buses ran on gasoline pretty much always until the 1950s. So when I think the diesel tax had only been in existence a year or two when the trust fund was created in '56. There had been discussions throughout the 60s and 70s saying that, well, because of what you said, saying that, well, since the trucks put on more wear and tear, diesel taxes should be higher. That never actually happened. They were the same rate through 1982 tax increases. But in 1982, the Treasury Department and DOT had just delivered this wonderful, detailed highway cost allocation study that tried, for the first time in decades, to say, okay, four-wheel, small cars, large cars, pickup trucks, small trucks, major trucks by weight, each puts this amount of per mile wear and tear on the system. So here's how you should line up your revenue system to match classes of vehicles. And the taxes in the original 1982 Act that were increased were supposed to match up almost perfectly with that Treasury cost allocation study. Part of that study said that these super heavy trucks over 70,000 pounds cause so much of a disproportionate amount of wear and tear on roads and especially bridges that they should pay a lot more. So in the original 1982 Act, the heavy vehicle use tax was up to, I believe, it'd be about $5,000 to $6,000 a year today. It's much bigger than it is now. And the owner-operator truckers protested so hard that one of the protests turned into a riot and somebody got killed. But the truckers, particularly owner-operators, screamed so much about that higher heavy truck tax that 2 years later, Congress changed the blend. They lowered the heavy truck tax to cap it at $550 per year, where it's still at today, instead of what's now the equivalent of several thousand. And in exchange, to make up for the revenue that was lost then, they increased the diesel tax by 6 cents a gallon, just so that the change would be revenue neutral over the 5-year budget window. So that's the reason why diesel is taxed 6 cents higher, is because the cost of cutting the heavy vehicle tax in 1982 was the equivalent of 6 cents per gallon then. And Congress then has now viewed diesel as more of as a tax on trucking, along with the other 3 truck taxes. So they said, okay, as long as the trucking industry overall is paying the same amount of money, we can change the blend of one trucking tax versus another.
Got it.
So
and then another question from former Eno Board of Advisor member Janet Kavanoki. Does the gas tax increase estimate factor in projections in fuel economy and other changes to efficiency and other vehicle mixes?
Yes, CBO generally bases their consumption model on the Department of Energy EIA reference case scenario that's updated every year, that does take into account presumed changeover in fleet to more efficient vehicles, more electric vehicles. So there is some of that modeling in there. Whether it's the right amount of modeling, I don't know, and no one else does. But there is a good faith effort built into those projections to model change, which is why the amount of gasoline at 18.3 cents a gallon, the billions of dollars it raises, drops every year. Trucking, diesel and trucking taxes were going to go up enough to keep it relatively flat because of increased overall GDP. But the amount of yield per cent per gallon of gasoline tax is going to decrease a little bit more every year in perpetuity in those models.
Another question here about the user pay model. If we were to abandon the user pay model and use general funds, wouldn't that make it more difficult to fund multi-year highway projects?
We'll get to that. Right now, there are things you can do to fund, provide multi-year certainty that don't necessarily have to involve trust funds and contract authority. But it has generally been easier. The whole budget system we have now that was set up in 1974 was sort of a treaty between the appropriations committees of Congress and then Ways and Means and Senate Finance on the tax side, trying to figure out a way they could all get along. The politics of that, committees aren't nearly as powerful now as they were in the 1970s period. So we still haven't updated the congressional budget process to accommodate the current leadership-driven structure. It's still stuck in the 70s when committee chairmen were king. So there are a lot of changes that need to happen. They've been happening sort of ad hoc, and the parts of the Budget Act that prevent committees from providing more general fund multi-year certainty, unless they had user outlays, are perhaps could be less strong now to reflect the point of view that the committees that hashed all this out in 1974 aren't nearly as strong as they were now either.
All right. So last question, just in the interest of time. A couple people are asking about um, uh, we're talking about user pay models and specifically the gas tax. What about VMT fees? How does this work with electric vehicles? What is anyone talking about anything beyond gas tax as it relates to the user pay model and the trust fund?
People are talking about, people have been talking for 15 years about various new options to maintain post-fuel, post-gasoline, and post-diesel highway user charges. There were two blue ribbon commissions in 2008 and 2009 that reported, both of which recommended a gradual change over to VMT, because that is the way that you could maintain, by switching to a vehicle mileage tax, you'd be able to maintain the user pay system. But no one's ever done any serious work implementing. We got better pilot programs at state level now than we ever did, but we're still a decade away, maybe, even if we work pretty hard at getting a recording box in every car. But more importantly than that, no one has still done any work on, and I'm talking about this till I'm blue in the face, no one's done any work saying how the IRS would actually administer this. Are you telling me you're seriously going to put a box in so there's close to 200 million cars in this country, put a box in every single one to report to the government, even though some of these cars are only driven, a couple thousand miles a year, would pay like $30, $40. Is it really worth that? Right now, the gas taxes and fuel and diesel tax are beautiful structurally because there's only 1,300 or so points of collection at the tank farm and refinery. That's easy for the IRS to get, $30 billion a year, $35 billion a year out of 1,300 points of collection. You don't need much manpower for that. If you're going to tax drivers or vehicles, you're going from 1,300 points of collection to 100 million, 200 million. You're almost 100,000-fold increase in the complexity and details of collection. I'm not at all sure that it's worth it at any kind of low level to do that kind of work just for the point of maintaining. The administrative costs could conceivably be so huge that it wouldn't necessarily be worth it just for the point of maintaining the user pay principle.
Got it. All right, we're going to take a pause on questions. Jeff, go through your next section. We will have another question, a poll question that comes up in a few minutes.
Yes.
And then we'll have some more questions then. So keep them coming.
The highway trust fund, as we saw, is overextended. The highway part and the transit part are overextended to different degrees. The 1982 bill, what I call the Treaty of 82, increased gas and diesel taxes by 5 cents a gallon. They were 4 cents. They were raised from 4 cents to 9 cents in exchange for a new mass transit account that would get 1 cent of the 5. The penny for transit, they call it, in exchange for urban votes. It got 20% of that new increase. Then, when Congress had another nickel increase in 1990 and a 4.3 cent increase in 1993, eventually, when those were deposited in the trust fund, those were also split 80% highway account, 20% mass transit account. So right now, mass transit account gets 2.86 cents per gallon because 20% of a nickel is 1 penny, 20% of another nickel is another penny, 20% of 4.3 is 0.86. That's where that comes from. However, the 4 cents that were before 1982 are still all in the highway account, and all those 3 trucking taxes, the truck sales tax, the tire tax, and the heavy tax are all 100% highway account. So here's how they're split. You can see that in FY20 actual, 21.3 billion highways, 4 billion transit gasoline. Similarly, 9 billion highway, 1.25 billion diesel, and then 5 billion, 500 million, and 1.5 billion are all, for the others are all highway account. So highway account got 87.8% of the revenue. Transit account got 12.2% of the revenue. Transit account has averaged 12.6% of the revenue. Like I said, truck taxes are very volatile. Trucking goes up and down, so that percentage varies. But over the 5 years of FAST Act, 12.6% was the average transit account split of tax revenues. But there are 2 ways that mass transit is funded out of the highway trust fund. One is actual upfront money, new formula bus account contract authority from the trust fund, portion directly to states. It was 10.15 billion last year. Then also, each state and MPO that gets highway money or transit money, they can choose to spend some highway money on a transit project or vice versa, what they call flex transfers. And then when that happens, an equivalent amount of cash is moved between accounts of the trust fund to accommodate that state MPO flex. No way to predict exactly what that's going to be each year, because it's up to each individual MPO and state as to what projects they choose. CBO used to have a plug for 1.0 billion a year, and OMB used to say 1.3 was their future guesstimate. And it used to be on the CBO side about 1.1. A couple of years ago, it jumped to about 1.5, 1.6 billion a year. Not quite sure why. We can't get any good data out of DOT that's public that says which cities and states and MPOs and have actually upped their game in transferring highway projects to transit. But so those are the two ways that you can fund transit out of the trust fund: your direct contract authority from FTA or flex money from highways. So FY20 actual, you had your 37.5 highway, 5.2 transit, plus interest income, plus highway only safety penalties, and then that 1.56 billion flex out of highways to transit. So post flex, it was like 36.2 billion to 6.8 billion highways to transit deposits and transfers. Over the last several, but whether it's 5.2 or 6.6, over the last several reauthorization cycles, Congress has increased spending on transit out of the trust fund more than it has on highways on a percentage basis. That 2.86 cents per gallon doesn't get indexed for inflation, but since the truck sales tax is effectively indexed for inflation, it's always going to increase a little bit more on the highway side than the transit side. For whatever reason, FAST Act gave 17.4% of total trust fund contract authority out of the transit account, and the transit account only took in 12.6% of the total funding, of the total tax funding. I mean, that's a significant imbalance. You can see here that as of 2019, 2020 was a little weird because it was COVID year, but you say that the on the highway account they were about 19% overextended. On the transit account, it was about 35, 36%. Sorry, it was like 17.4 and 34.7. So that shows it. So the transit account is significantly more overextended. There's obviously only so long you can go, authorizing $10 billion a year of new contract authority from a trust fund account that's only getting $5 billion a year in new taxes. And these are the CBO projections from the new baseline as to the annual deficit for each account as a percentage of total outlays. We've got our little COVID divot here, and then going to keep going up and up and up and up. So we go back to our earlier fundamental question: are we going to keep the user pay model or not? If we make the trust fund solvent through user tax revenues, then you've either got to cut mass transit contract authority way the hell down from 10.2 to around 5. You've got to cut transit in half, or break the 80-20 split of new tax increases, because they're going to, transit's going to need, if you increase those revenues, they would need closer to 28% of any new tax increase, or some compromise splitting the difference between cutting transit contract authority in half and giving them 28% of it. Or Congress just keep borrowing money on the bond market, ignoring Section 4.1 of the Budget Act, and depositing that money in the trust fund however it wants. Because if Congress is going to go float a bond on the bond market today, transit or highways, neither one is entitled by God to any particular percentage of that. So here's fundamental question number 2. Should we restructure the excise taxes to increase mass transit's share of the taxes, or no? And that's poll question 2. And then we have 4 answers there, I think.
Yeah, we'll give you all a minute to read those answers and see how you vote. Well, looks like a lot of you seem to be liking the last option.
I had written the questions down here. The option 1 is to give transit, is rearrange the current tax, no new tax increase, just give transit more than 2.86 cents of the current gas diesel tax. The highway lobby, AAA, the highway users, construction lobby, and a lot of red states would just go ape if that happened. like I said, the trucking industry would go to war if you give any part of the 3 existing trucking taxes to mass transit. You could increase taxes and break the 80-20 split. It would be interesting to see how far the highway interests would go along with that before they walk away. Or you could have some kind of new non-highway tax you would deposit in the mass transit account. And I see from the poll results that is the most popular option. So,
yeah, it looks about 50% of you voted to deposit into a new non-highway tax into the mass transit account, but still pretty good portions looking to either give transit more than the 20% or give transit more than 2.86 cents.
Now, I will say this, that when you're talking about new sources of revenue for any kind of trust fund or dedicated fund, you got 2 different sets of considerations. You got, your fairness issues of is this tax, is it tax fair? Is it fair to tax this group of people for this purpose? Is the tax equitable amongst different classes of users, et cetera? There's also a practical aspect of reliability, because if the whole point of this of a trust fund of segregating specific taxes from specific spending is to tie them together in the long term past 1 year's budget cycle, which means it's very important for the tax to be reliable. It's actually more important for the tax to be reliable than it is the tax to be fair, because you can have the most perfectly fair tax in the world, and if the receipts suddenly drop off 7 years from now, your program's going to be out of money. Whereas a less fair tax that was more reliable will keep on funding your program like clockwork. I am reminded discussions in 1978 through 1980 about creating a mass transit trust fund before we had a mass transit account of the highway trust fund. That when Jimmy Carter was deregulating oil supplies, it was obvious that to stop the shortages of gas stations, that we're going to have to deregulate, and that was going to cause oil companies to make a lot of money. They couldn't do that politically, so they said, okay, we'll have an oil windfall profit tax, which was actually a tax it was tied to the price of a barrel of crude oil. And Jim Howard, who chaired House Public Works, wanted to set aside part of that tax to fund a new mass transit trust fund. He didn't get the votes, but if he'd had, it would have been the biggest disaster in mass transit history, because CBO's original projections for this oil windfall profit tax that was going to support this trust fund was going to be, I think, $10 billion a year in 1985. Instead, it wound up being zero, because the Saudis flooded the market with oil, and funny things happened with oil prices that caused the long-term value of that tax to be zero instead of whatever it had been projected to be. One of the biggest whiff in CBO estimating history, I think. Right? Maybe that was joint tax committee, I can't remember. But so basically, yeah, place not your faith in commodity markets. Anything on the commodity market is not stable enough to be a long-term revenue source. The reason the gas tax is so beautiful as a long-term revenue source is because it's based on a couple of billion individual transactions every year. And that many transactions are hard to really shift a lot one way or the other. It's much more volatile to have a revenue source that's either based on a commodity market, or GameStop stock or something like that, or based on a very small number of payers, in which case anything goes wrong with one of the major taxpayers, you have a big wiggle.
So Jeff, one of the things that a few people pointed out is that an option missing from here was continuing the current status quo and just vote to continue moving transit funding from the general fund. And the reason why we didn't include that, and what do you think the poll results would have been if we had included that one?
If I had included just make them, cutting them from cutting the contract authority from 10 a year to 5 a year, and then increasing the general fund subject to appropriation by the same amount. I know some hardcore highway guys would have gone for that. I'm not sure who else. And also, I didn't want to reduce my font here. I had 6 options and I cut 2 out. I can't remember which ones they were. I was trying to keep the font up. But we're going to get to that in a little bit about other alternatives for going outside the trust fund prospect. But we also the path of least resistance, unfortunately, has been to just keep shoveling money from the print money, deposit in trust fund, spend how you want.
All right, let's go on to the next section.
All righty. There's another inevitable consequence of a user pay system, which is that leads to a lot of regional equity considerations. The original interstate map guaranteed some states would subsidize others. I mean, look at the map. This is the map that was drawn up by the 48 states and BPR in 1947 of the interstate system, and it took Congress 9 years to figure out how to fund that map. But you can tell from just looking at that map, any Joe voter can look at it and know there's no way in hell that these big Rocky Mountain states and Upper Plains states, big square states, were going to be able to support that many high-quality interstate lane miles per resident. I looked it up yesterday, and in the 1960 census, New Jersey had 14,500 residents almost per planned interstate mile on that map. Wyoming had 355 residents per interstate mile. I mean, no way that 355 people, of which at that time in big nuclear families, less than 200 were probably wage earners, could actually get together and support, building, grading, and maintaining a mile of interstate quality road. But without those, you can't get from the East Coast to West Coast. So it was obvious that some states are going to have to subsidize others to build the national network of roads on that map, the fixed routes on that map, and nothing else. That was a social contract they entered into in 1956. Said, okay, we're going to have some states subsidize others and get done with it. By 1970, you had 70% of the lane miles already open to traffic. And that was the first instance of the phrase donor state in a congressional hearing in 1970. It was Indiana. Kept growing. More and more states talked about how they contributed way more taxes to the Highway Trust Fund than they had received in funding from the trust fund, because as part of the user thing, the FHWA every year published a table saying how much each state had estimated paid into the trust fund, part of the user pay thing. And then as the interstate kept getting closer to completion, the donor state complaints kept growing in Congress. And meanwhile, the states that did do very well in their interstate funding, as the interstate was getting complete, didn't want to see their percentage shares of the total program go back down to their pre-1956 formula levels after the interstate was finished. So Congress built this increasing number of sort of Rube Goldberg formula patches. Minimum allocation was the first one in '82, I think, and then more and more after Ice-T, there were about 9 or 10 of them. Donor states were getting a minimum percentage rate of return on their highway trust fund tax payments. The politically wired-in donee states who had legislators who had Mr. Chairman as their first name, nevertheless, we're going to be able to keep something close to their interstate level of funding in a post-interstate environment. And so that's the way it wound up. Then after the trust fund ran out in 2008, Congress froze the formulas. Every state today, to this day, is still guaranteed the same share of total highway money that they got in October 1st, 2008, except there's a 95% donor state minimum highway formula versus versus 2-year previous highway account and tax payments. Only Texas has triggered this 95% level. I've got some difficulties with that because, first of all, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, highway and truck and bus safety, are paid out of the highway account. I personally believe that should be taken off the top and not subject to any kind of donee state calculation, because making sure that you don't have diabetics driving 18-wheelers and passing up behind the wheel, killing a bunch of people, that serves multi-state purposes. That money should be taken off the top out of the gas tax equation. And then also there are other things like FHWA overhead and the National Research Program, BTS, it should probably be removed from that in general. But basically, since 2012, but only Texas has triggered the 95% rule. But then you look at the history, FHW publishes a table, the July 2020 edition of Table FE221. Going back to the dawn of time, July 1st, 1957, started the trust fund to September 30th, 2020. Trust fund took in the highway account $1 billion, paid out 1.2, roughly 1.229. 49 states in DC over that lifetime of the trust fund until last September had received a collective $209 billion more than their tax payments. That's most of the 114 bailouts plus interest on balances, which used to be a significant thing back when interest rates were 13% a year. New York is $15 billion to the good. Alaska's $13 billion to the good. Pennsylvania 12.5, California 12, West Virginia 7.9 billion to the good. Again, this is highway account, dollars in, dollars out And then there's only one state that has received less funding in apportionments and allocations, apportionments formula, allocations, discretionary projects and things like that, and it has paid into the trust fund, and that is Texas. Texas is still 1.725 billion in the red. That may be less here as we get, we're partly through another year. So we'll see how that lines up on September 30th. But if we decided to go on and get rid of the user pay thing, Texas would complain. But at this point, the entire cost of donor donee is just writing Texas a $1.7 billion one-time check and then telling them to stop complaining about this. Everybody would then have received more money than they paid in from 1957 through 2020. So one would hope that, another couple of, if we do keep going down this road of just continuously putting more money from general revenues into the trust fund, where it becomes fungible, complete fungible, untraceable with real user tax payments, we'll stop that. But as long as they're reporting income and payments, the mass transit donor problem is obviously much worse, because the Senate highway formula was always about sharing the wealth widely, Senate driven for the most part since 1916. Mass transit formula has always been much more about needs based, ridership, number of buses, rail cars, service miles, population, cost of upkeep. It's always been a less state driven, less Senate driven political formula. FTA gives transit funding directly to cities and providers, so a lot of time the bulk of the money doesn't go to states, state governments, and the state by state totals are intentionally difficult to come by because they don't want people making these connections. But FHWA still reports manual mass transit account tax payments, and OMB in the budget in the back of their reports the payments out of the account in terms of obligations, not contract authority, not outlays. So you can see in 2019, the pre-COVID year, the last year we have, there was 11.5 billion in new obligations out of the transit account versus 5.3 billion dollars of tax payments, interest, etc. So nationwide, everyone's got a 217% rate of return. This is just in 2019, but California got about 2 billion versus 531 million in tax payments. New York, but basically there are five, New York, California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, DC, collectively got 5.8 billion out of the transit account versus paying 1.2 billion in. The other 45 states was about 5.7 to 4.5. There are, 25 mega donee states plus DC, 27 lesser donee states, and 18 actual donor states. You probably shouldn't have some of these states that don't bother to do much mass transit. There's only so much money that you could give to Montana, or North Dakota for mass transit and have them be able to spend. We may have already exceeded that in the COVID aid, by the way, actually. But as long as you're talking donor donee, OMB puts the spending money out there, the spending totals out there, and FHW puts the tax numbers out there. DC only paid about 4 million a year in the highway account. They only pay about 25 million, I think, totally into the trust fund, because I looked it up yesterday. There's only 122 gas stations left in DC, and the sales numbers are about fuel sold in state, not necessarily calculated to be used in state. Anyway, so this leads us now to fundamental question number 3. Should donor-donee debates continue if we keep getting further and further away from the user pay model, or should we just call a halt to the whole thing?
All right, we're watching votes come in. Feel like I'm on CNN and I'm trying to assess polls coming in. Got. Let's see.
Come on, people, vote.
All right, they're piling in at the moment. All right. Exit polls are saying that the no's might have it. All right, we can probably close the poll now.
Yeah.
All right, so we had 36% say yes and 64% say no.
Excellent, excellent. I used to, before 2008, I was actually, I was actually a believer in the donor state thing, and we've now moved far enough away from that to where that I think I personally believe it's time that argument is put to bed, unless we actually do the really difficult thing and make the trust fund completely user pay, user benefit again. But again, part of the price, the political price of making the trust fund user pay, user benefit again, sustainable, will be to perpetuate the donor-donee debate and possibly extend it on the transit side. So just so you know, that's what might happen. Anyway, getting down to general fund appropriations, the other funding source. As most of you on here knows, two types of authorization in the surface bill: contract authority, which is actually budget authority, which is normally real money. It's actually provided by the surface bill itself, shows up every October 1st on the books for the duration of the authorization unless repealed, and allows grant recipients to be assured years in advance, roughly about 90% of how much money they're going to get. And the simple authorization, which in this bill, everything except one or two PIMSA accounts for pipeline and hazmat, are the general fund. So for the target level for subsequent budget authority provided by appropriations in the annual appropriations bill, and cannot legally be guaranteed in advance, because that's what the whole thing of discretionary means. Congress has discretion each year to kill the account. That's what discretionary means. FAST Act, $281 billion in highway trust fund contract authority, about 92% of the total. $24.3 billion in authorizations for general fund appropriations. You can see that different, the different modes of administrations at DOT have different degrees of reliability on trust fund versus general fund. Highways is 99, almost 100%. Highways and motor carriers basically completely reliant on the trust fund contract authority as their authorizations. NHTSA, the vehicle safety, is 20%. The highway safety is contract authority 80%. FTA is 80% contract authority, 20% general fund authorizations. PIMSA and FRA are 0% contract authority. The rest are annual authorizations. So, like I said, about 92 to 8. Also, just as an aside, you'd think that if 80% of FTA's budget were money that's multi-year money guaranteed 5 years in advance, and the other 20% of FTA's budget can only be legally guaranteed 1 year, at a time, that the projects that would have the longest lead time, be the most difficult projects that need the most certainty, would be getting money out of the multi-year budget. But no, for various political reasons, the multi-year new start, new subway systems, new light rail systems, new extensions of systems are funded out of annual appropriations. So their full funding grant agreements aren't legally binding contracts. And they say on there, this is not legally binding promise by Uncle Sam. We can cut you off at any time and you have no legal recourse whatsoever. So I just always found that kind of odd, that they have multi-year money, they choose not to use it on the projects that are most in need of multi-year funding. So we look at how the appropriations committees actually performed on these FAST Act authorizations. For the FHWA, the only general fund programs were authorized by FAST Act tended to be some Indian reservation stuff, and they didn't do that well. They gave 78% of that money. The NHTSA general fund monies, the vehicle safety, got 92% of their authorization, but transit got 101% of their authorized general fund targets. Amtrak got 109%. The other FRA grant programs that were new, created by FAST Act, got 98% of their 5-year authorization, and PIMSA got 103%. So given the fact that the authorizing committees and the appropriations committees for decades fought tooth and nail, did not agree about these programs, were fighting each other for authority, this has actually been a surprisingly good sort of era of good feelings here. They got the total general fund appropriations to fulfill promises made in the FAST Act, 103% of the promised amount of money. That's, and this is mostly because, and again, this is a backhand way of saying this, it's mostly because of Donald Trump, not because he liked mass transit or any of these, but because when Trump got elected, he demanded enough defense spending increases that Republicans had no choice but to give in to increasing the annual caps on total appropriations for non-defense as well as the Democratic buy-in, which and they blew the caps off by so much that appropriations actually had money to fully fund all these programs. If Republicans hadn't done a turnaround and decided they wanted more defense money after Trump got elected, and therefore accepted significantly higher non-defense spending as well, these numbers would have been much worse. But you know, Trump gave them permission to stop pretending like they cared about the deficit, and then boom, it's done. Now, not all surface transportation authorizations that come up in the annual bills were actually authorized by the FAST Act. That $150 million a year that the DC subway WMATA gets is actually under the jurisdiction of what used to be the old District of Columbia committees of the House and Senate. Now it's the Oversight and Government Reform in the House, Homeland Security, Government Affairs in the Senate, I believe. But that was from the 2008 PREA law, not the FAST Act. That authorization expired in 2019, but the appropriations keeping it going. There are periodic general fund appropriations to top off the FHW emergency relief program that, as needed, as hurricanes and earthquakes and mudslides happen. And then, because they had so much extra money in 2018, 19, and 20, because of those cap increases, because Trump wanted the defense money, they actually put about $9.5 billion into other highway and transit programs and FRA maglev and loan subsidy refunds that were not specifically authorized by the FAST Act, which was, like I said, quite impressive. So fundamental question number 4, should railroad programs and the mass transit new starts, the new extensions that I mentioned that are subject to these annual appropriations, get guaranteed multi-year funding? And if so, how? And I put up with 5 different issue possibilities, I believe, on how we could do this. You could dedicate a revenue stream and contract authority from the existing highway trust fund. The Senate did this in 1997. The Senate actually voted narrowly to dedicate a half cent of the gasoline tax to a special Amtrak account in the trust fund. The House was able to beat that in conference. Bill Roth actually wound up trading it away for $2.6 billion in magic rebates for taxes that Amtrak hadn't actually paid. Or you could put a new account in the trust fund, call it rail, intermodal, whatever. You could either fund that with more magic bailout money or some kind of dedicated revenue stream without users. You can establish a new trust fund, with or without dedicated revenues, and just keep ignoring Section 401 of the Budget Act. You could do what they're doing in the current budget reconciliation bill and just create a bunch of new one-time mandatory general fund budget authority in a hypothetical infrastructure bill to come up on the floor this spring. Or you could actually do annual appropriations provided years in advance. Here's what people forget is that there are such things called advance appropriations. You can put money in an appropriations bill that doesn't become available for multiple years down the road. When the mass transit program first was happening and they started, they were getting appropriations 1 year in advance. So the FY 1968 appropriations bill contained the mass transit funding for 1969. Today, the entire Veterans Department health system gets appropriations 1 year in advance, as does like $4.4 billion of HUD and a couple of other HHS accounts. And somehow, at some point, PBS and NPR, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, was able to convince Congress that it was so important that it should get its annual appropriation 2 years in advance. So the FY 2020 appropriations bill contained the FY 22 appropriation for CPB. So one can definitely make the argument that if it's good enough for National Public Radio and PBS, it's certainly good enough for infrastructure. And again, the problem with that is the budget committees really don't like it. They put an annual limitation in the budget resolution saying no more than X billion dollars of advanced appropriations in these accounts. But the budget committees aren't nearly as powerful as they used to be anyway. If we're going to be making a lot of things make more sense, that's certainly another way to do it.
All right, so the results are in, and Jeff was campaigning for the different, or at least explaining them as we were all voting. But your discussion about annual appropriations provided years in advance was the winner, second only and closely by the establish a new trust fund. I was kind of surprised to see that. Your thoughts on this, Jeff?
Again, there are advantages and drawbacks to each of those, and practically speaking, there's no way to do anything new under the sun without violating some kind of budget law. But like I said, the budget committees aren't nearly as powerful as they used to be. And to the extent that Senator Sanders is now the chairman of the Budget Committee, he's not going to be the one standing in the way of finding new ways to use the budget process to provide significant new investment. Several of these might work. I'd be curious to have people, you could conceivably have any kind of, if you want to phrase mass transit and intercity rail as climate issues, you could conceivably have any number of climate-based pay-fors for some kind of trust fund for those issues. Again, remember that for volatility reasons, you do not want to include commodity prices in there. So I would not, no tax on oil prices or anything like that. But if some other kind of climate-based pay for might conceivably be used and be able to meet Section 401.
So a couple of questions that came in, Jeff, of course, is nobody got to answer the first part of this question, which is, should we do it in the first place at all? A yes, no kind of question. So I mean, what are the prospects of something like this moving forward, and how much traction have you heard about it in Congress and in the policy discussions?
There's a lot of discussion out there. Again, I get my inner libertarian gets the deal that the hesitancy, there's less of a core federal mission of interstate commerce about mass transit being inherently local, and also that there are significant things. The prospect of perpetual Amtrak subsidies, for long distance trains does not excite me, and the prospect of building high-speed rail networks along those I think no one should delude themselves that we're going to build a 220-mile-an-hour bullet train from Chicago to Los Angeles, because who in the hell would that's still 10, 11 hours versus a 5-hour flight. There needs to be a lot of I personally believe we should get rid of the long east-west routes and concentrate on federal development of high-speed rail city pairs, that makes sense in the sweet spot of distance. But again, there's a lot of discussion going on right now, and I'm getting the sense that the White House is open to a lot of things that would translate into big infrastructure investment, but has really not settled yet on how to go about any of this. They still haven't done the big question of whether or how much to pay for a lot of this. And if you're not going to solve that question, you're not going to be able to get to the subsidiary questions.
Got it. All right, go ahead.
No other questions?
Yeah, the question bank has been somewhat quiet. I think part of it is that some of the questions folks have asked, you've then answered in your subsequent slides. I know that I think that's true for most of them. If those in the line, if you feel like that perhaps I missed over a question or whatever, you can feel free to either re-ask it, or we can always follow up afterward. But I'm getting the sense that a lot of these that you're touching on as we go through. And there will be a kind of an open session here at the end after this last section.
Yeah, well, people, we're an hour in. People are good to sleep now. So, all right. And now we're going to take a little brief, but we're going to ready to closure. But just looking at the past, there's annual federal outlays for highway mass transit from this wonderful CBO report that comes out every so often, that on public spending on transportation and water infrastructure, 1956 to, I think most recently was 2018, and then I extrapolated and added 2019 and 2020. You can see, so the dark line is highways, the green line is mass transit, and then the dashed lines I backed out to show the 2020 spending level, throughout time. And these are in constant 2017 dollars, which CBO uses. They don't use CPI. They use a producer price index specifically that's tuned to a lot of the transportation related capital costs and operating costs. So on the one hand, I love this, but I've always hated CPI. Going back to when I had it explained to me when I was a staffer on the Hill in 1993 or 4, that the Clinton healthcare plan paid for of them doubling of a cigarette tax that would double the cost of a pack of cigarettes would cost the federal government X amount of dollars because cigarettes were such a huge part of the CPI basket of goods, And you can't have cigarettes increase that much in cost because Social Security COLAs will increase and federal employee COLAs will increase, et cetera. I've never liked CPI since then, but I like this index of index to the cost of things like building materials, land use, labor, structural steel, et cetera. Except that something weird happened in 2004 with the price of steel doubling that freaked this index out. So notice that it shows the inflation adjusted constant 2017 dollar investment in highways and bridges peaking in 2004. But regardless, the amount that we're spending right now on the federal level on highways is pretty much as much as we were spending in peak interstate. And then again, in the peak of we spent our way back up from the 82 tax increase, we more than doubled the gas tax. So while spending is a little bit off the all-time high, look in the broad scheme of things, 1956, in terms of constant dollars, the federal government, it's not like the federal government is spending drastically less than we were in some halcyon good old days. Similarly, on mass transit, the federal government is spending as much on mass transit now as it ever was in constant dollars. So that's something to keep in mind, that even though ASCE and others keep coming at us with the big backlog of crumbling infrastructure, that the fact that the infrastructure is crumbling is not because the federal government is spending significantly less than it used to. Real highway spending peaked in 2002, like I said earlier. The current spending level of 46, 47 a year is the same as the peak of interstate spending. Similarly, the $15 billion of mass transit spending, the Obama stimulus peak, right now $13 billion a year, the same as 20 years ago. That's the same as 20 years before that. Then you have to look at what we're spending money on. Looking at just mass transit here, this is annual federal grant outlays for mass transit. 1963 to 2017 in constant dollars from that same CBO report. The blue area is operations and maintenance, and then the gray area stacked on top of that are capital grants. That's the left axis in billions. The dashed green line is how much of a percent of total federal grants for mass transit go to operations and maintenance. And you can see how once they turn the floodgates on, it spiked at about its right axis. So, about a little over 1/3. And then it dimmed for a while, and now we're back to about 30-35% of total federal mass transit grants being used for O&M. Now the key to remember to that is operations and maintenance, because there's different types of maintenance that can be more capital intensive or less capital intensive. At some point, the difference between preventative maintenance and capital spending is kind of a eye of the beholder things. But within that O&M, there are the true operating expenses, salaries and benefits for bus drivers, train drivers, other conductors, station personnel, other workers. Operating expenses were not part of the original Kennedy-Johnson vision for the mass transit program, and they were not part of the Nixon transit program. And it was Nixon who really was the first guy to put serious big money into mass transit. It was like a $150 million a year program when LBJ left, and it was over $1 billion a year once Nixon put money in the 1970 bill. Real operating expenses were made eligible for federal funding under Gerald Ford in 1974 in the lame duck session when they finally ganged up on him after years of saying no, done as as a response to the emergency recession because state and local governments were facing all these revenue crises, particularly New York City and its looming municipal bankruptcy that might have happened the following year. Which may sound familiar here, not New York City particular bankruptcy, but the emergency response. And then later on, you started seeing in 81 or so these GAO reports about how operating expense costs were skyrocketing because the federal government was basically throwing in bottomless amount of money to support them with no cost control. So the 82 law started cutting back on federal operating subsidies. The 91 law cut back a little more. And finally, in 98, the T21 law eliminated federal support for operating expenses for urbanized areas over 200,000 in size, which is all your big, medium-sized cities and but your smallest cities. But because of COVID, the federal government is currently subsidizing mass transit operating expenses everywhere, as well as airport operating expenses, state highway bureau operating expenses, and reimbursing for-profit airlines and intercity bus operators for the salary and benefit costs of their operating expenses as well. As with 1974, this is justified by a severe economic emergency, threatens the insolvency of many transit providers and other people. And I'm kind of concerned that as with 1974, temporary may become semi-permanent, because there were calls from some of the from some transit stakeholder groups, even before COVID existed, that we should go ahead and try to bring back federal support for operating subsidies. And so I'm now on the final question here. What becomes of the federal capital versus operating divide for mass transit funding for now? Because, should the pending COVID aid have some kind of time limit for operating systems? Because in the House bill, that $30 billion, which, by the way, CBO just said not all going to be spent. There's no way that the transit providers can spend that much. They said that 27.8 is all of that could actually be spent. And if you look close at the House bill, they don't have to contractually obligate that money until September 2024, which means under the 5-year rule, it doesn't actually have to be spent till 2029. I'm not sure that COVID will be the main factor in operating costs in 2028 or 2029 or even 2024. But, should there be a tighter timeline on the operating expenses side of the COVID aid? Should the ban on the federal OPEX subsidies for urbanized areas over 200,000 be enforced again? And if so, when? And then the final sort of big thing question, I'm not sure if we have a poll question or not, but if there is going to be a new normal post-COVID ridership level in mass transit that is measurably below the pre-COVID level, and this could be because of the less attractiveness of urban downtown commutes, because of increased work from home forever as a permanent thing, more reluctance to ride transit, more people buying cars, whatever. If there's a new normal of demand that's measurably below pre-COVID levels, whose job is it to fill that fare box gap? Is it the feds or state and local? Because again, at some point, new normal becomes normal. And isn't the federal government's job to provide operating assistance to mass transit providers in normal times? Should it be? So that's because I'm sensing that is going to be a big issue in the reauthorization cycle, is about whether to bring back operating expense subsidies permanently under the initial guise of COVID, and then find that once the foot's in the door, make it permanent. Oh, we do have a question.
All right, so we have one question of the 4 that you just talked through that's focused on the what becomes of the federal capital versus operating divide for mass transit.
All right.
So take a look at those questions, and we'll see the results coming in. A couple of you have already voted. A couple of people are asking it. It's not it's multiple choice, but you have to pick just one.
I did not know that. I have never used our GoToMeeting quick poll before.
All right, just give it a couple more seconds here, and then we'll close the poll. All right, go ahead and close it. All right, so here we go. Here are the results. Tied for first place is that either the federal or states and locals should just fill the fare box gap, with then 12% voting to remove the time limit, and then 10% only enforcing the ban on federal OPEX subsidies.
Interesting. Anytime that there's a difficult question asked of what a federal policy should be, and the 2 leading options are tied 39 to 39, that's not something that Congress is going to be able to solve very particularly easily. It's that seems to indicate that it is going to be an issue this cycle. Anyway, I believe that is the end of the presentation, and I was going to tie it all up in a bow, and I didn't get the last slide done. But the job of this is just to lay the groundwork out there of the revenue hole in which the FAST Act has left us, the new CBO baseline that came out fortunately last week, and just to try to get people thinking about those big fundamental questions, not necessarily just these 5 that we posted, but but others because I'm getting the sense that we may resort to unusual steps to make some permanent changes in these transportation programs. To the extent that you're taking unusual steps already, it's the best time you could find to actually address some of these fundamental questions. I'll ramble for a moment to say that I'm pretty sure the decision has not yet been made about how much to use budget reconciliation on infrastructure in the springtime. It has some advantages of being, not some filibuster in the Senate, but as we've shown, the Highway Trust Fund has a bunch of interesting little exemptions from budget laws that have enabled $153 billion of bailouts so far that technically didn't have to be paid for. Some were, some weren't, but none of them had to be. And it also exempts Highway Trust Fund spending. It's 99% exempt from budgetary sequestration. It's completely exempt from pay-as-you-go budget rules, completely exempt from the annual budget control act spending caps, which expire in 3 months. But because it has all these exemptions and is neither fish nor fowl of the budget process, it's very difficult to make changes in budget reconciliation that affect the Highway Trust Fund. If you're going to enforce the budget rules on reconciliation, you can't do another Highway Trust Fund bailout from general revenues in budget reconciliation. You cannot create new contract authority in budget reconciliation out of the Highway Trust Fund if that contract authority works the way the normal ones do in the normal accounts and is subject to an annual obligation limitation in the annual appropriations bill. You cannot authorize programs for subsequent appropriation in a regular appropriations bill, and you cannot do many changes in existing statutes like Title 49 and Title 23 in the FAST Act if each line of that change in law doesn't directly affect mandatory federal revenues. You can put a bunch of money in a reconciliation bill from the general fund. You could conceivably put hundreds of millions of dollars of money in a reconciliation bill for infrastructure out of the general fund, but it would have to all be spent within 10 years for the most part, because you can't have a reconciliation bill cannot increase the deficit after the 10th year. And there are significant questions as to how detailed you could get in spending instructions for that money before it became extraneous. So because of that, I'm pretty convinced that the bulk of surface transportation reauthorization will have to be handled outside the reconciliation process. But you could conceivably, put a bunch of one-time money in a reconciliation bill and then, fill in some of the details later on in a surface transportation reauthorization bill that goes through regular order.
Well, with that, Jeff, you answered a bunch of the questions that have been coming in over the last couple of minutes. So I think that hopefully satisfies some of the reconciliation questions that came in. I had a question here about the graphic that you put up a few slides ago, talking about the spending per GDP, based on inflation. Are those adjusted per capita? With the question being that as more people and more users are using the roadways, would that not necessitate an increase in spending?
That's not per capita. That's actual dollars each year converted by the Congressional Budget Office using one of the producer price indices produced by the Budget of Economic Analysis, the one for state and local spending. It was the PPI for state and local spending on streets and highways, I think, because it is state and local governments that actually spend almost all of the money through these federal grants. Federal government reimburses them later, but the actual spending authority is state and local. So it's not per capita. It was actual raw dollars outlays each year converted by CBO. And I commend their report to everyone because it slices each mode by federal versus state and local and by capital versus O&M, and you can combine and contrast to your heart's content.
Got it. Question, I think somewhat related. You showed how the mix of transit spending has shifted from CapEx to O&M over time. Is this also the case for highways?
Not at the federal level, because the federal government does almost no operations. The federal government, I think some of the FHWA research and then operation of public lands highway, roads in national parks, the federal government's got to, clean them, repave, clean resurface, run the toll gates or whatever, public lands, federal lands. But for the most part, the federal role on highways is the grants is pretty much all capital. So there's not been much significant change over time.
Got it. A question here about priorities for Congress and perhaps the administration, talking about equity, which Jeff, you and I had a conversation earlier about how equity can mean different things to different people. But as equity, however you define it, has become an issue in decision-making processes around the country, how does that get weaved into the reauthorization part?
That is a very good question. You may have noticed that like 2 days before Trump's term expired, DOT put out notices of funding availability for build grants and infra grants. And then on their first or second day in office, Team Biden pulled those back, and Team Biden put out a new notice on the infra grants yesterday or the day before. And basically all they'd done is they struck out a transparency thing that Team Trump had added, and they kept 4 of the 6. They kept the 4 criteria that Trump had added 2 more. They added 1 on climate, how will the project affect climate change, and the other is equity considerations in the project. So making sure that your new decisions on distributing money and issuing new regulations, et cetera, take a lot of different equity factors into account is easy. It starts to get difficult once you drill down into the laws that have been on the books, sometimes in Title 23 and Title 49 for decades, and trying to, and also if you start changing formulas that states have relied on for decades to add equity components, states are going to want to try to figure out in detail how it will affect their financial bottom line before they necessarily endorse them. But the more granular you get in terms of how it gets in law, the more difficult it's going to be. Which is why I'm skeptical that we might get a full reauthorization bill this year, just because it's very complex writing a new reauthorization bill, particularly when you want to amend a lot of these programs that have stood up for decades and decades on their own to add new considerations like climate change and equity, and have them be there in the deep down in the core of the law. And the Biden administration isn't quite fully staffed yet, and just in the terms of getting a bill written, it would be a hard sell for them to get done by midsummer. And midsummer is when a bill would have to be through committee in the House and Senate in order to have a chance of getting signed into law by September 30th. So that is problematic. But again, again, equity means a lot of different things. It's about equity and access, equity and opportunity, equitable readdressing of the disparate impact of infrastructure decisions made decades ago, whether it's freeways dividing neighborhoods in the city, or favoring or access to a existing road favoring one neighborhood, not another, things like that. But they're all part of complex balancing processes, and trying to write laws that balance those properly for administrative law judges to decide, or whoever it is to decide, is going to be a very complicated endeavor.
Got it. A couple of questions that I think we touched briefly on earlier, but I want to revisit it. Is the the administration and congressional Democrats have been talking about reemphasizing electric vehicles, new electric vehicles, charging stations. If some of the priorities to dramatically increase CAFE standards and dramatically expand the fleet of electric vehicles come to pass, what does that do to the reliance on fuel taxes in terms of the long-term projections of the trust fund?
Even the most optimistic views of fleet changeover aren't that fast. I mean, I just bought a Mazda CX-5 last Memorial Day, and I plan on driving it till the wheels fall off. That's the way I do all my vehicles. And so unless I win the lottery or something, I'm not going to be in the market for a new car until probably 8, 9, 10 years from now, no matter what the federal government does. And I suspect a lot of people that are like me. Now, they did, even in the bill that the Environment and Public Works Committee did in the Senate last year, the bipartisan bill that everybody from Bernie Sanders on the left to Mike Braun on the right voted for. They did spend Highway Trust Fund money on electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. Part of the deal that Chairman Barrasso and Ranking Member Carpenter had struck was that, okay, with the finance committee, in exchange for that, everyone was going to agree that electric vehicles should pay something into the Highway Trust Fund. That is the deal the Republicans made last Congress, is that in exchange for supporting trust fund payments for EV infrastructure, EV's got to pay something in. They weren't really concerned about how much or what the rate was. The important thing was the principle of getting EVs, getting the camel's nose under the tent wall, and getting it on record as a matter of principle that EVs had to pay something into the trust fund in order to get EV infrastructure funding out of there, and then they would wait till another cycle down the road to try to set the proper level of what EVs should be paying. So I expect to see that again, is that part of the, if Republicans are going to buy in at all to getting EV infrastructure out of the trust fund, they will insist on some kind of EV tax or registration fee as the quid pro quo.
Got it. Another question related to reauthorization, talking about the House rule about 90% of the proceeds coming from user fees. What happens if the Rules Committee decides they're fed up with it and they decide to not grant the waiver?
It's not a House rule, it's law. It's Section 401 of the Budget Act. So theoretically, that applies to both the House and Senate. In reality, it's one of those laws the House Rules Committee has waived in the past. And in the Senate, there's no, if they can get 60 votes, they can waive anything via motion. But practically speaking, no one was raising their hand to raise that point of order, even before anyone had thought about waiving it. So practically speaking, it has proven very difficult for the Senate to enforce points of order that prevent a bill from coming up in the first place. It's a little easier to enforce points of order that can knock out an offending provision on the floor, yet leave the underlying bill intact. There hasn't been the people in the Senate for the last 3 cycles. Senators have not believed that maintaining the 90% self-sufficiency rule was an important enough principle to keep a highway bill from coming up in the first place.
Got it. Another question, is there a possibility, and what would it look like if a gas tax increase was passed through budget reconciliation?
The gas and diesel taxes are some of the only taxes that could actually be increased in reconciliation and deposited in the trust fund. Because the measure here is that every single word or sentence or half sentence clause in a bill under the Byrd rule has to measurably affect federal revenues or federal outlays out of the non-discretionary outlays. And the words, quote, to be deposited in the highway trust fund, unquote, don't affect federal outlays, or for federal revenues. The tax will bring in what it brings in federal revenues, whether it's general fund or not. So the way I've read it, and it's been explained to me, is that you can't really increase some new tax and dedicate it to the trust fund in reconciliation. But in the 5 current taxes, gasoline, diesel, truck sales, truck tires, and heavy truck use, the to be deposited in the highway trust fund part is already written into law in the tax code, and thus does not have to be repeated in a reconciliation bill. So all you can do, you can strike 18.3 and put 40 cents or whatever it is in a reconciliation bill, and it would be allowable in reconciliation. So the reconciliation basically limits you, as I understand it, to increasing existing highway trust fund taxes or increasing taxes for the general fund, new taxes, but no new tax for the highway trust fund, as I understand it.
Got it. Well, Jeff, I see we're right here at the top of the hour at 5 o'clock. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and really thanks for everyone buckling in. And it was a a good 90 minutes, and hopefully folks learned quite a bit. Every time I hear Jeff talk, I learn something. So there's a few questions that we didn't get to. We'll be following up with you in the next couple of days or weeks as we get to it. And again, thanks for tuning in. Continue to send questions if you have thoughts or things that you want to send us. You can email Jeff and or me directly. We're happy to answer those. But thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff.